Yeah, one thing that the bio that's in that little brochure doesn't include, about 2 weeks ago I got a certificate of recognition from the the California State Senate. Joel Anderson signed it for my efforts of what I do with the Constitution. And it was funny because when I'm a talker. If you know me and you've learned, I can gab. I've got the gift of gab. The radio show is perfect for me. The problem is when the show's over, it's like, get out of here now. You're done. Don't talk anymore. So they give me this reward or this award, and they ask me, say something. I'm speechless. They were stunned. And no one had ever seen me not able to just blabber. So, but anyway, it's great to be here. What a great group. I drove all the way in from Murrieta, so it was a kind of a fun drive. I took a break in Beaumont because it's kind of a long drive for me. I stopped in Beaumont to get some gas, and my car, this little 1995 sedan, my mom was worried. She says, "You going to make it out there?" I said, "No, the car will make it. It won't like it, but it'll make it." So I get to Beaumont, I get gas, and I pull the gas cap off, and all this air comes sucking out of it, which, this little car normally does it when it's almost out of fuel, but I got about, a little over half a tank. I just wanted to make sure to top it off, I'm coming out here, and all this air comes sucking out, and this gas just splashes all over me. Now, luckily, I wasn't wearing this shirt. So I'm like, I smell like gas. So when I got here, I'm like, you have a bathroom? I smell like gas. She's all, yeah, I can smell it. So if anybody's got a lighter, don't light it. Now, I've been teaching the Constitution in Temecula since 2008. And I love doing it. It's a great group. I started actually with the Tea Party. What had happened was, if I walk back and forth, that doesn't bother anybody, right? I mean, because I have trouble just standing here. I like to move around, see people and all that. But anyway, so what was going on is in the 2008 election, there was this gal named Mary Bono Mack. I'm sure you're familiar with her. And in the press enterprise, she described herself as a progressive Republican. So I was ready to throw my hat in the ring. That's it. I didn't care if I had no political experience. I was going to run against her. I was ready to just anything just to get rid of her. And I thought, wait a second, Doug, you have no experience. You've never run for anything. Maybe you need to find out who else is running. And there was this guy named Clay Thibodeau that ran against her, and he's a constitutionalist. So I got a hold of him. I said, I can give you time. I have no money, but I can give you time. So I knocked on doors for him, and I met this gal named Jane, and we're talking the whole time. And by the end, she says, gosh, you really know a lot about the Constitution. And I said, well, thank you. I appreciate that. And I said, do you know anything about this Tea Party thing? It's back in 2008, remember? And Tea Party was just starting to emerge. I said, you know anything about this Tea Party thing? She said, oh, yeah, I'm a part of the one in Temecula. So I hooked up with those folks, and after talking to them, gosh, you know a lot about the Constitution. So we set up a Constitution booth for a rally. And I sat there and I was answering questions about the Constitution, handing out Constitutions. By the way, there's a whole mess of them back there if you guys want them. Jane helped me in this booth. And afterwards she says, gosh, you know so much about the Constitution, you ought to teach a class on it. Yeah, okay, I guess I ought to. 2 weeks later she says to me, oh, by the way, the owner of Faith Armory Gun Shop said you can teach the class there. Oh. Okay, I had never taught a class before in my life. The only public speaking I'd ever done was speech class in junior high and speech class in college. And so suddenly now I'm teaching a class, I'm public speaking at Tea Party events, and I got no clue what I'm doing other than the knowledge that's in my head about the Constitution. And the first few months of the Constitution class was horrible because I was just treading water. And then finally, I learned from it, and we moved forward, and finally got to the point where I created a pretty decent curriculum, and we just work our way through the Constitution bit by bit. Now, I'm going to give you a taste of that tonight because I want you to understand something. The United States Constitution is not just some document. It's not just something that they just kind of put together and, this will work. And in fact, if you read it carefully, here's the one thing you realize. And I'm so glad this is at a Calvary Chapel because I've actually had people walk out when I say this, believe it or not. It was inspired by divine providence. Say that a little louder. Woohoo! Divine providence. God's hand was in that document. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more, at the very end, what does it say? The blessings of liberty. Now, I can't count how many times I've had a statist, a leftist, a progressive, a liberal, whatever you want to call it. I don't like saying liberal because we're actually the liberals. They hijacked that word. But anyway, because the word progressive wasn't working so well because all of their policies were failing. So the people who we would call conservatives were calling themselves liberals, so they stole the word, like they do with all other language. But anyway, blessings of liberty. Who gives blessings? I can't count how many liberals say, well, there's no mention of God in the Constitution. Blessings of liberty right there in the preamble, for God's sake. We, the people of the United States, those are the people who made this Constitution. Here's what was going on. I'll give you a little bit of historical background. This country was not a nation. It was not a national country. It didn't have a national government. It had a confederate government. We were a confederacy. We were under something called the Articles of Confederation, which was written during the American Revolution. And during the American Revolution, in order to pay the soldiers, they started printing money and just printing money and printing money and printing money. It was funny because it wound up being worth nothing. You thought we'd learn. I mean, American Revolution had happened. But anyway, and so you got these soldiers that this nation is a nation because of them. And so the war's over, they've got all this money and it's worthless and they can't pay their bills with it. And it's being demanded they pay their debts. Well, wait a second, we got this money, it's worthless because all the government did was just print it. There's no value attached to it. They didn't coin money with gold and silver. They just printed this paper stuff, this worthless paper. As much as things change, they say the same, right? Okay, but anyway... Oh, you don't even know. Well, we're going to talk about stuff that's going to blow your mind. But anyway, and so it got to the point where they were blocking the steps of courthouses. And there was this guy by the name of Shays that was kind of the guy who was kind of in the face of this rebellion. It was called Shays' Rebellion, 1786. And here's what happened. The government under the Articles of Confederation could not field an army, because it was up to the state militias. Each state had their own militias. There was no central government army. They also could not tax to pay for an army or tax for any other reason. That's why they just printed money. They couldn't tax. And so there was nothing they could do about Shays' Rebellion because they couldn't call on the state militias because, well, all those American Revolutionary War veterans, they were the state militias. So what happened was the merchants in Boston put together a mercenary force to put down this insurrection. Now let's bring this to modern terms. Could you imagine the veterans from Afghanistan and Iraq were upset about something? They got together and they, whatever ruckus they wanted to create, and the federal government did nothing about it. And so the corporations put together a mercenary force, showed up and started shooting those guys. How would you feel? That's how the founders felt. Because that's what happened. It was the merchants in Boston. We got a problem. So at the Annapolis Convention in August of 1786, they got together and they decided the Articles of Confederation needed to be fixed. Now I'm going to tell you right now, when you hear that story, I'm going to tell you right now, more than 3/4 of those guys knew they weren't going to fix the Articles of Confederation. They knew they were going to create an entire new government. They knew a new constitution was going to be written, but they couldn't say it. Because Americans were so afraid of a central government. Of course, they didn't even call themselves Americans back then. They were Virginians. They were Pennsylvanians. They were New Yorkers. Each state was its own little country, its own individual entity. Just like you and I are individuals. We're different from each other. States are different from each other. They're unique. They're supposed to be unique. Supposed to be different. And so they got together. They decided they were going to get together in May of 1787 for a convention. Now, they did it in secret. Now, the liberal left will tell, and progressive left, will tell you that those guys will tell you that they kept it in secret because it was, just a government for, the white, rich guys. No, it was because they were fighting and changing their minds so much they didn't want the public to think they were nuts. And also, in order to do this, to keep it secret, they had to close the doors, close all the windows. They only had a couple vents at the top. During the heat of summer with no air conditioning and no deodorant. So you can imagine what it was like in there. in a brick building. And they are fighting like crazy. They're getting nothing done. First 4 or 5 weeks, nothing done. They're just fighting. It was like watching parliamentary proceedings in Taiwan. I mean, they're jumping over the tables practically and beating each other up. And there was this old elder statesman, the oldest guy in there, these round spectacles, sitting in the back and watching all this stuff and didn't say a word the whole time. Then finally, this man, who people of today would tell you was a deist or an atheist or something like that, says, you know, we were on our knees during the American Revolution, and now we have forgotten the Creator. Shouldn't we be turning to Him at this time? As I've gotten older, I've learned that if He knows every sparrow that hits the ground, surely the Creator is involved in the affairs of men and the creation of empires. That was Benjamin Franklin that said that. I'm not going to sit here and say that Benjamin Franklin was practically an evangelist. He wasn't. But he knew what he saw, and he knew what he knew. He knew what he had experienced. He had seen God in that American Revolution. He had seen God in the creation of this nation. And he knew that if they didn't drop to their knees right then, this wasn't going to work out. So he recommended that they pray before each session. Now, the thing about prayer back then is it was a big deal. They wanted to hire a clergyman for it, but they really couldn't afford it. And remember, they really didn't want the outside world to know they were practically beating each other over the head. So what they decided to do is they went a couple blocks up the street to the nearest church, and they prayed there. These are the men who are supposed to be secular, separation of church and state stuff that we are told. And they went up the street and they prayed, and after that, things started falling into place. This Constitution started falling into place in ways that it was a miracle. Now, James Madison, he's my favorite of them all, and here's why. He was kind of a nationalist guy going in. He was actually kind of a statist. He would probably have more in common with the Democrats today than you do. And he went into that convention as a statist. He came out as a limited government guy. Through all the arguments he learned, he recognized the reality, what was best for our country. The guy knew he was wrong, admitted it, and changed his ways. You got to love a guy like that. Father of the Constitution, it was his template that they basically went off of. But if you read John Tyler, he has a book called A New View of the Constitution of the United States. It was published in 1823, and he spends the very first chapters explaining how most of the founders that walked into this place, into this convention, believed that they should have a national government. They'd had a confederacy before, which was the opposite extreme. A confederate government under the Articles of Confederation was sort of like the European Union, where the member states had all the power and the organization had none. What they realized, though, was under the Articles of Confederation, the government was a lamb. What they needed was a lion. Here's the problem with lions. Lions eat you. So how do you create a lion and keep it from eating you? You've got to restrain it. You got to chain it. You got to cage it. Here's the cage. Here's the restraining chains. So they had to create a government that was strong enough to handle what needed to be handled, the external issues, what was good for the Union, common defense, disputes between states, the post office, keeping everybody in communication, protecting the trade routes with a navy. They needed that. But at the same time, they also needed to be strong enough to handle those things, but limited enough that it left the states alone for them to handle their own stuff. If it was inside those borders of the state, it was none of the federal government's business. It was up to each state, because the states are individuals like you and me. But gosh, Doug, then the states would be different. Yeah, isn't that great? They're supposed to be different. State issues are state issues. This state might do one thing on an issue. This state might do something different. This one might do something totally different from that. You know what that creates? Innovation. If you have a set standard by a federal government dictating the states only do something a certain way, there's no innovation, and we never progress. And they call themselves the progressives. They're more like regressives. So in order to progress, they need to be individuals. Like a free market. Each state's different. One state might do something and it makes a lot of sense. The other state says, hey, I'm going to try that, and I'm even going to make it better. Or another state might do something that's real stupid, like California, and the other states will watch and say, I ain't doing that. Yeah, I like to tell, I love California. I was born and raised here. All my family is from Arkansas, but I'm born and raised in California. But here's the fascinating thing about California is it became a state in 1850, and it really hasn't changed much. Really honest, gunfights in the streets and everybody speaks Spanish. But well, okay, there is some differences. The men hold hands and... but anyway, no, I love California. I grew up here. I have been back east, Washington, D.C. and all that. I love the Constitution. But here's the thing. These states are individuals. They're different, and they're supposed to be different. Now, that said, let's have a few lessons. Let's learn something. How many of you have grabbed a Constitution from the table back there? If you haven't, please grab one. I want everybody to have one. Don't cost you anything. Please have one or pass them out. However, I want everybody to have a Constitution because we are going to use the Constitution as our textbook tonight. We're going to go through a couple things, and I bet you I'm going to surprise you on a few things. I bet I'm going to read something and say things that you didn't expect. And here's why. We have been conditioned for 200 years to believe this says one certain thing, and we were taught wrong. Jane, the gal who had the idea for me to have the Constitution class, she says to me, Doug, for the first few months, I was mad at you every night. I went home mad because you weren't teaching the Constitution right. You weren't teaching it like the way I was taught. And then I realized that was the point. The Constitution was written with an original intent. What has happened is we have a court system that interprets it. You know what happens when people can interpret something? That means they can create the definitions. And when they can create the definitions, they can get it to mean anything they want. Here's the funny thing about the courts, and this will be lesson number 1. Judicial review. You know what judicial review is, right? That's when the federal government, federal courts and the Supreme Court, they decide whether or not a law is constitutional or not. Now, if you read the Constitution, there is no place in there that gives the courts that authority. You know where they got that authority? The ruling of John Marshall in the 1803 Marbury versus Madison case. In other words, they gave themselves that authority. Now, in my opinion, that's seizing power. You know what a government is if they're seizing power. A tyranny. Now, it's gotten worse over the years. The courts have, capitalized on. But let's think about judicial review for a second. This document is supposed to limit the powers of the federal government. But if the Supreme Court's deciding what is or isn't constitutional, which means they're deciding if the federal government has a particular authority, then what they're doing is, because they're a part of the federal government, is the federal government's deciding for itself what its own powers are. Doesn't sound like it's in line with the Founding Fathers, does it? Let me give you another one. Article 1, Section 1. Go to page 1, which is actually like page 7 or something like that. Page 1, it's right after Roman numeral 6. Right underneath the preamble, that part with the blessings of liberty. Article 1, Section 1. All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and House of Representatives. It's pretty straightforward. All. The word all is the first word. What does all mean? I know it's shocking. It means all. All means all. Doesn't mean mostly. It doesn't mean kind of, sort of, maybe this, maybe that. It means all. All means all. What are legislative powers? The ability to make law, modify law, repeal law, strike down law, anything that has to do with the law. Legislative powers. Herein. It means herein. I know it's shocking. I actually was speaking to a group one time, and it was a mixture of adults and kids, and I asked that question. This little 8-year-old in the front says, herein. And everybody's like, man, the 8-year-old knows more than you. What's wrong with you? Yes, herein means herein. Herein what? Granted. Now, if something is granted, if it's given, there's a grantor and a grantee. The grantee is the federal government. Who's the grantors? We, the people of the United States. Of the United States. The states. We are the states. That's the reason why at the end of the 10th Amendment it says the states or the people, because we are the voice of our states, or at least we're supposed to be. I know it's hard to swallow in California. I can say the same thing in Kansas. It means something totally different. But in California, I'm like, oh, jeez. Granted also means to legally transfer. In other words, all the powers belong to states in the beginning, all of them. But the states took some of them and gave them to the federal government so it could function on those external issues. You know, the common defense and stuff like that. All right? Shall, there's God again, be vested. Vested is just like granted to legally transfer in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. All right, so all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in the Congress of the United States. All legislative powers. So, whenever the president signs an executive order modifying Obamacare, which he's done over 45 times, that is unconstitutional. Anytime that one of the regulatory agencies decides to create a new regulation that really creates a new law, like cap and trade, unconstitutional. I got one for you. How about when a court decides to strike down a law? Unconstitutional. It's none of their business. They're a court. Now, they can have the opinion that a law is not constitutional, and that opinion then can go to the representatives of the people, and the people can make their decision on what to do, but it's not the court's place to strike down law. You know, like, well, just, pull one out of the hat, Roe v. Wade. They struck down a state law. First of all, it's a state issue. There's no authority for the federal government to anywhere regarding medical care. And I haven't found it yet. And I just because you can tax doesn't mean that anything you tax is automatically constitutional. But anyway, so they're wrong on Roe v. Wade there. Plus, so it's a state issue. The court shouldn't even take in the case. Then on top of that, they're striking down a state law on a state issue. And then they're saying, oh, and this makes it legal and throughout the United States. They just made law. Or as another example, Proposition 8, same thing, right? None of the federal government's business. And someone asked me not too long ago, because I was talking about this very topic, and someone says, Doug, it must drive you nuts watching the news. You see all this unconstitutional stuff going on, especially you knowing this stuff. It must drive you crazy. Well, first of all, I don't watch much TV. I have a TV in my office that is good for two things, baseball and football. Yes, I'm still a guy. But I really don't watch much TV. I can't. I'm depressed by the end of the newscast. I don't want to watch that. But I am an optimist. I do believe this can be turned around. You ever heard the saying that if you give a child a foundation when they grow up and they become rebellious, they'll come back to that foundation? Thomas Jefferson believed the same thing about us. On the Roman numeral 6, the page to the left of the page you're on, at the very, very bottom, at the top it says educating the people. At the very, very bottom, this is what Thomas Jefferson had to say. The good sense of the people will always be found to be the best army. They may be led astray for a moment, but will soon correct themselves. Thomas Jefferson believed in you. He believed that you would return to your foundation. We may be silly. We may be doing something dumb right now. It's all our fault. Like I tell people all the time, Constitution didn't fail us. We failed it. We may be led astray, but we will return to it. I am an optimist. Now, how do we do that? Now, of course, the Second Amendment comes to mind. Yeah, I get in trouble. You have 5 tools in the United States Constitution for turning this country around. You're not supposed to use them individually. They all work together in different ways. One of them, the one we is a last resort, is a violent revolution. Thomas Jefferson so trusted central government that he believed we would have a violent revolution every 20 years. The blood of patriots and tyrants, tyrants and patriots. You've heard it, the tree to water the tree of liberty. Every 20 years, he believed we would have a bloody revolution. I think we're long overdue. That's one of your tools. Another tool is a peaceful revolution. That's what we're doing right here. It's a peaceful revolution. The founding fathers, the spirit of independence John Adams wrote was, and revolution existed long before the first shot was fired, and they were conspiring together in the meeting halls of churches and pubs. I always thought that was an interesting combination, the churches and the pubs. But where are we at? We're in a meeting hall at a church. I guess we're a bunch of revolutionaries. Peaceful revolution. This is a part of the peaceful revolution. The Tea Party, being involved, doing what you can. Another one is nullification. Remember how I was talking about a moment ago how the courts don't have the authority to strike down based on... It's not up to them to decide if something's constitutional. Well, if it's not up to them, then who's it up to? It's us, right? Through our states. Nullification is... Thomas Jefferson wrote in his draft of the Kentucky Resolution that it was the right of the states to ignore a federal law if it was null and void. In other words, if it was unconstitutional. That's nullification. 26 states sued Obamacare, sued the federal government over Obamacare. They sued the federal government through the federal courts with federally paid judges. How'd they think it was going to end? What a waste of taxpayer money. However, if those same 26 states had gotten together and said, we're nullifying this, we refuse to implement it, it's unconstitutional, we don't have to implement it. 26 states, that's more than half the states. What do you think would have happened? Either there would have been a real earthquake in the political world, or the federal government would have done what they did in the 50s over the integration issue and showed up with troops. One of the two. And if they showed up with troops, that goes back to that Second Amendment thing. That's why we're armed. Okay, so nullification. I want to talk about the Second Amendment real quick. I know I've got my five tools that I wanted to go over, but I want to talk about nullification the Second Amendment for a second. How many of you know the Second Amendment and you know what it means? I'm going to surprise you. I'm going to surprise you. All right, a well-regulated militia is how it begins, right? By the way, it's on bottom page or middle of page 21. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Shall not be infringed. That's pretty straightforward. Now, when the Bill of Rights was written, and I believe they still are, it applies only to the federal government, that means that every single federal gun law is unconstitutional. Every last one of them. If there's going to be any regulation at all, it has to be at the state level. That's up to you. Closer government gets the people, the more democratic it becomes. Being necessary to the security of a free state. Not a free government, but a free state. A free California, a free Virginia, a free Massachusetts, a free New York, a free state. Being necessary to the security of a free state. The security of a free state. What, from a foreign enemy? Well, no, that's what our army's for. Well, then what possible enemy could we need to be armed to protect ourselves against? Yes, the federal government. A tyrannical central government. Being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms. It's a right. It's a natural right. It's God-given. You have that right because you were born. God gave it to you. But here's the part now where I'm going to stun you. A well-regulated militia. What is a well-regulated militia? One controlled by the government? That's what a lot of people think. Word regulated. Well, it's being regulated, right? No. Well, you have to go back to the definition of regulated. And guess what? Remember we were talking about language earlier, how they kind of monkey with language? Yes, they have with regulated as well. Regulated to the average person in today's society means control and restrict. If the government's regulating something, they're controlling and they're restricting it. If you go back to the 1828 Webster's Dictionary, which is the closest dictionary you can get your hands on, it's online, and you go back to that dictionary and you look up regulated, that's the last definition or the least used. The most used is weights and measures. When you are putting sugar in your coffee, you are regulating the sweetness of your coffee, right? So the second definition is the one they used. What is the definition of regulated then? To put in good order. Well, that makes sense because American Revolution, our militias weren't exactly in good order. They weren't well trained. A lot of them didn't even have shoes on, much less shirts or muskets that were the same size. It was a mess. George Washington was an amazing man. He not only won that war, but he did it with a bunch of farmers and store owners and that were barefoot and missing socks and different size muskets. Oh, what a mess. A well-regulated militia, then, is a militia that is put in good order. It's in good order. That's what a well-regulated militia is. Now, the federal government in the U.S. Code defines a militia under two definitions. You have the organized militia and the unorganized militia. The organized militia is who? National Guard, state militias, the naval militia. Who's the unorganized militia? I wonder. Oh, it's us. Yeah. Now, they do have an age limit, but I have a feeling if things went down, no one will care about the age limit. We are the unorganized militia. And the government defines us as such in the U.S. Code. Now, going back to nullification, what do you think would happen if 26 states, instead of going through the federal courts with the federally paid judges to try to fight the federal government, had nullified, they stood together firm, and the people stood behind them with their arms? This would be a whole different situation right now. Obamacare would be in bigger trouble than just a website. All right, so we talked about nullification. Tool number 4, because we talked about peaceful revolution, violent revolution, bloody revolution, whatever you want to call it, nullification. Then we got secession. What? Secession? Wasn't that what started the Civil War and all that jazz? Well, yeah, but it's a very valuable tool. These states are not a member of this union forced into it. It's a voluntary decision. This is a contract. It's a social contract. And if the federal government breaches this contract, the states have a right to get out of the contract. And that's a tool to get them back in line, to threaten secession and actually secede. Well, Doug, that's kind of radical, don't you think? You know, the Founding Fathers were called radicals, extremists. That's what they were called. Yeah, it is kind of radical. Radical things for radical times, I guess. Secession is a very valuable tool. Our states are voluntary members of this union. I can't count how many times people go, no, Doug, they can't secede. Well, then you're telling me they're forced to be a part of this union. Well, then that's not freedom. If the states are individuals like you and I, and we have the freedom to dislocate ourselves if we decide to and turn our back on our citizenship if we want it or whatever, why can't the states? Through the vote of the people of that state. Secession is a very valuable tool. Then the final tool, and I was actually in a conversation before this about this final tool. It scares a lot of people, and that's because a lot of people misunderstand it. Convention. You've heard about it, Article 5 convention, all that, right? You've heard about that? It's a tool given to us. Matter of fact, I guess there was a speaker at an event you went to not too long ago that was, what was that? Where was that? In Orange County, was it? Costa Mesa Saturday. Mark Levin used to disagree with me. He now agrees with me. I think that's evidence that he reads my website. But anyway, well, here's the thing. There's 3 kinds of conventions, actually. First of all, you hear about the CONCON. Well, Article 5 convention and CONCON are 2 different things, first of all. A CONCON is a constitutional convention. There's been one, and there should only be one, and that was in 1787. The one that wrote this. The second one, an Article 5 convention, if you read Article 5, it explains that there's 2 ways to amend the Constitution. Either the Congress can propose an amendment with 2/3 of Congress, and then it goes to the states for 3/4 ratification, if they can get 3/4 of states to ratify it, or through 2/3 of the applications by the states can have a convention to propose amendments, but it still takes 3/4 of states to ratify it. In Federalist 85, Alexander Hamilton said to the anti-federalists who were scared to death of this Article 5 convention thing that was the fail-safe. It still takes 3/4 of states to ratify it. If they're able to rewrite the Constitution with some real garbage and 3/4 of states agree to it, we got bigger problems than a CONCON. Now, that said, there is a third option when it comes to convention. Very few people talk about this. It's a convention of states. Or a friend of mine has coined it as being a republic review. Remember I was talking about judicial review? It's a play on that term. Instead of judicial review, it's a republic review. It's who's supposed to be the final arbiters of the Constitution? Us, through our states. Now, if it takes 3/4 of the states to approve an amendment, 3/4 of states to approve an amendment, that means it only takes 1/4 plus 1 to stop something and not allow it. So, if the states got together through our delegates in a Republic review and audited the federal government, and only a quarter of the states plus one says that's unconstitutional, guess what? It is. And then the states can get together and say, we're nullifying it. Department of Education, Department of Commerce, Department of Transportation, Obamacare, Federal Reserve. Over 85% of the government is unconstitutional. If we were to eliminate all unconstitutional federal spending would be about 5% of GDP. If we were to eliminate the income tax, revenue would be what it was in 1998. And we would have more than enough money if we were spending only constitutionally. Now, here's the problem. I talk solutions, and these are all great. Here's the problem. There's no switch. We can't just go, okay, let's flip the switch. It took us a long time to get here. It's going to take us a long time to get where we got to get going. And sadly, most of us in this room, if we do get this thing turned around, are not going to be around to see the end of it. Our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, it's going to be on their shoulders. And I say this to every group, and I'm right every time. Why is it that most of the people in this room are older than me? Where are the young folks? Why are they not involved? You too busy with a smartphone? NMTV? If we're going to turn this around, we got to get this information to them. People say, well, Doug, wait a second. You're preaching to the choir. What good is a choir if they don't know the words to the songs? If we are not fighting for this is only ink and paper. Constitution is not the problem. We are. We have not been defending this because we don't even understand it. Well-regulated militia. More often than not, everybody in the room had never heard that before. On rare occasion, I'll come across someone who knows what regulated means, but it's rare. Why? All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress. It's so simple. Separation of powers. Legislative powers belong to the legislative branch. Executive powers belong to the executive branch. Judicial powers belong to the judicial branch. Meanwhile, we've got a president who thinks he's all three branches. With BP, he was judge, jury, and executioner, was he not? And we've got politicians going, well, there's nothing we can do about it. One of the myths in my book is, and I know most of you were taught this, that we have three co-equal branches. That's a myth. We don't have three co-equal branches. Now, today's political world will tell you, no, the president's the strongest. No. If you break it down and what the Founding Fathers established, the legislature is supposed to be the strongest branch. Congress. And they're treated like they're the weakest. The judicial branch, the courts, are supposed to be the weakest branch. In fact, John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the United States, he resigned his post so that he could become governor of New York. And then after his term in New York was up, Thomas Jefferson, who knew he had won the election and was getting ready to become president, got a hold of John Jay and said, well, there's going to be an opening. I want you to be Chief Justice again. And John Jay said, no, that position's beneath a man. It's too weak of a position. The courts have no power. The court system wasn't even going to be created. Did you know the judicial branch wasn't created till the fourth to last day of the convention? They were actually going to not even have a judicial branch. States have the judicial system. We don't need a federal one. It's dangerous. Well, yeah, but what about international law? What about disputes between states? So on and so forth. Okay, fourth to last day, they created the judicial branch. Legislature is supposed to be the most powerful. And of those two houses, the House of Representatives is supposed to be the strongest, which is interesting because if you look back in history, the Senate was not voted in by the people originally. The senators were appointed by the states. It was the voice of the states. The voice of the people was the House of Representatives. And the House of Representatives, the voice of the people, has one power that's stronger than any other power in all of government. Power of the purse strings. All budget bills, according to Article 1, Section 7, has to originate in the House, the voice of the people. So that if the federal government's doing something wrong, they can starve it of money. Someone asked me, what do you think the Founding Fathers would have thought of a government shutdown? I think they would have loved it. That was the whole point. Starve them of money, eventually they will give up because they can't stand up to the House. The problem is, we have been conditioned to believe in what's called federal supremacy. Supremacy Clause, Article 6, does not say that the federal government is supreme on all laws. Here's your final lesson. Let's go to Article 6. Article 6 is at the bottom of page 15. Very, very, very last paragraph. It says, this Constitution and the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and the treaties made and which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. Supremacy Clause. That's right there, Doug. All things federal are supreme. No, it doesn't. This Constitution is supreme law of the land. Treaties made or shall be made are, and this very important part. The laws of the United States, the laws of the federal government, which shall be made in pursuance thereof. In pursuance thereof of what? This Constitution. Therefore, it goes back to that nullification thing. Therefore, if a law is not constitutional, it's not authorized, then it's not supreme. Period. Well, yeah, but Doug, the federal government does something, it just automatically makes it constitutional. In what world is that? See, this is based on something called the rule of law. How many are familiar with the rule of law? And when I say rule of law, I don't mean the rule of the courts. The rule of law. John Locke wrote about it. Natural law of nature's God. Goes God again. In fact, that's the way it's said about, that's the way it's explained in the Declaration of Independence. When my favorite Supreme Court Justice, Clarence Thomas, was being confirmed, there was a senator named Joe Biden who questioned him on what basis are you going to make your rulings? And Clarence Thomas said, natural law. Biden said, natural. No one believes in that anymore. That's ancient. That doesn't even apply to our system. It's not even mentioned in any of our documents. Clarence Thomas explained to him what natural law was, but he decided not to tell him that it is in one of our documents. It's in the very first paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. Joe Biden thought he had it figured out. The rule of law is this. This is the rule of law based on God's law. Your rights are natural rights. They were God-given. If they're not God-given, then government could take them away. But because they're God-given, the only person who can take them away from you is God. It's none of government's business. So the rule of law is a set standard. It's a law that cannot be taken away. What they're working on is something called the rule of man, where the man interprets, decides what the law should say, and it gets twisted and changed and all that. When man abandons the rule of law and they begin following the rule of man, it's not very long before we start dancing around a golden calf. We're dancing around a golden calf right now, aren't we? Because we've abandoned the God-inspired, divinely inspired Constitution of the United States, the second greatest document ever written, second only to the Holy Bible, in my opinion. The Founding Fathers knew that this was inspired by God. It was a miracle they pulled off the American Revolution. This document is a miracle. And after it was all over, Ben Franklin pointed at President Washington's, president of the convention, not yet president of the United States, President Washington's chair, and there was this depiction on the back of the chair. There was this hill with a sun. And he was using that in reference to this new country, United States. He says, is that a rising sun or a setting sun? It was a rising sun, and it still is. We're still rising. We're not setting. This is not the twilight years of the United States. How dare we even consider that? Here's the thing. A lot of people argue with me about what I'm doing. Doug, it's too late. There's no chance. Well, I got three answers to that. Either we get this turned around, or we are Cicero. You know who Cicero was? Cicero, BC 79, was watching the Roman Republic become the Roman Empire, and it was a very bad thing. The Roman Republic, where the legislature was becoming irrelevant, entitlement programs were run amok, transfer of wealth. The founders called the redistribution of wealth the schemes of leveling. It existed, no difference. They called socialism utopianism. Cicero argued that Rome needed to return back to honest government, the Roman Republic. Otherwise, they were going to collapse, and no one listened to him. One time in the legislature, he was talking to them, and they turned their backs on him so they wouldn't have to listen. He wrote a book about honest government after he got exiled for his efforts. And his publisher says, "Who's going to read your book? You were exiled." You know who read his book? Thomas Jefferson. Maybe we're Cicero. He couldn't save Rome, but Thomas Jefferson made sure that Cicero's writings was a huge influence on this system. Maybe we are establishing a template for the generation that pulls this crud out of the ashes. Or then there's the third possibility. God's hands, this is it. It's the end times. There's no turning it around. We know who wins on that one. But if that's the case, and we're still fighting the good fight, what a witness. What an incredible witness to everybody around us. That as Christians, we are still fighting the good fight. I'm going to leave you with this. I say this often. The Constitution is the solution. If we were to follow the Constitution, all of these issues would be resolved. But it's not an easy fight. And it's going to take a long time. But if we don't fight it, who will? If we're not willing to, as the founders did, the final sentence of the Declaration of Independence, put their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor on the line, depending on divine providence, who will? This is only ink and paper if we don't fight for it, my friends. Our rights don't belong to us if we give them away. They belong to us. We got to fight for them. We got to be involved. We got to learn this. Because if you don't understand the instruction manual, how are you going to put together that canopy that's got 82 different moving parts and you got no clue what goes where? You need the instruction manual to put that dude together. This is the instruction manual for turning this country around. This is the instruction manual for how this system is supposed to run. The dynamics of our system is out of whack, and it's up to us to turn it around. It's up to us not only to turn it around, but it's also up to us to teach the younger generation. You need to understand this so you could tell them. God bless you guys that are in here. They're younger than me. God bless you. Thank you for spending the time with me. It's been a pleasure. If you got any questions, thank you. If you got any questions, I'm going to hang around as long as I can up until everybody goes to church or whatever. I've got my book, 25 Myths of the United States Constitution, back there, 12 for 1, 2 for 20.